Hello and welcome to this episode of the Ideas Factory. I'm Nakma. We will look at the developments around the world this week, and very interesting is the Republican convention, President Trump's renomination acceptance speech there, and also the contempt proceedings against Mike Pompeo. Along with all that, the very interesting statement that Ivanka Trump could probably become a better president than Kamala Harris coming from Donald Trump. Other than that, we will look at all that is happening around India's neighbor vis-a-vis Sri Lanka and Indian Foreign Secretary's visit to Dhaka, the India-Bangladesh relationship, then also the India-Japan ties, because Shinzo Abe has just resigned from the post of Prime Minister. Whoever comes in place of Shinzo Abe will have a big challenge in front of him. Shinzo Abe really built on the India-Japan ties, which was progressing on many fronts. So we will look at all of that. Joining me is Professor Harsh Pant for this discussion. If we start, Harsh, with the Republican convention and the renomination acceptance speech by Donald Trump. The critics, of course, will say that it was full of tall claims and lies. And also we saw the contempt, or rather a full public disregard for the health guidelines, because it was a big gathering in the White House lawns. Everyone who was present there was unmasked, which looked like very deliberate. What was he trying to convey? Of course, he called Biden someone who would just shatter the American dream. How do you really look at this? I mean, we did not expect anything else from Donald Trump, but still analyze this acceptance speech for us.
Well, I think it was classic Trump, and it was also, the fact that these are extraordinary times, and he was sort of responding to those requirements in some ways, because he used his being in office to maximum effect. After all, he was, reaching out to Americans from the White House. So he was flanked, if you will, on the one side with White House, on the other by Lincoln Memorial. It was quite a sight. Those who have voted for him and who are his vote bank, they perhaps looked at it, and they got all the meat, that red meat as it is, to just rally them up and get out and vote for Donald Trump. So I don't think you would see any significant shift in the polling numbers, and I think that has been consistent for a while now. But I think what Mr. Trump was trying to convey with all the things that you talked about, whether it was nonchalance about the virus, whether it was the use of his presidency and the symbols of his presidency quite openly, which is something that exception has been taken, and the fact that unlike previous Republican conventions where major Republican voices would be featured, this time it was primarily a Trump's family affair, it would seem. Only a few people like Mike Pompeo or Mike Pence were there. Other than that, you had the mainstream Republicans, for example, the entire National Security Brigade of Republicans writing a letter and throwing their weight behind the Democratic candidate, Mr. Biden. Quite remarkable, I think, by American standards. What seems to be happening is that the Republican Party seems to be becoming more of a Trump party. And the whole ideas and vision and the narrative that has driven Republicans over the last several centuries has now become, almost marginalized in the way Trump is framing this election and in the way he has framed his presidency. So I think in some ways it would be very interesting to see what happens post-Trump. How does Republicans, whether he loses this time or whether he wins, what he's doing is he's remaking the Republican Party in ways that I think the traditional Republicans are very uncomfortable about. And therefore you are witnessing a lot of these, people leaving, not supporting his candidacy, mainstream Republicans. So I think what he was trying to do in this convention was basically to position himself as a candidate of a certain constituency, and not even trying to reach out to others, because his argument is that that they won't in any case vote for me. So why should I reach out to them? Rather, I will rally my base. I will make sure that they come out and vote for me on all the hot button items, that he has talked about. And therefore, whether it was immigration, whether it was foreign policy, whether it was domestic policy, whether it was racial issues, he took a tone which was quite extraordinary in terms of the nonchalance that he displayed, that as if nothing is happening in America, as if America is not tackling these socio-economic issues that are some of the gravest issues they've faced since the end of the Second World War. But I think that is something that is not his priority. His priority is to position himself as a commander-in-chief, as a leader who is managing the present crisis. And therefore, coronavirus is not there. We are all, working as if everything is normal, and not pretending to even reach out to others. And I think this is going to have very significant implications.
Absolutely, which is why probably we see that huge gathering without masks. Is time and again trying to prove that everything is normal in America, that is won over the pandemic, and probably his base vote buys that. This speech was also, as the Republicans said, totally lacked inclusivity, and the speech was totally for the base. But moving ahead, we also know that there have been contempt proceedings against Pompeo for the political misuse of the departmental resources. So do you think that would in any way affect this election and its outcomings?
I don't think so. I think this is whether or not Mr. Pompeo was using, he was out as a Secretary of State. Propriety would have demanded that he did not do that, but he went ahead and did that. But I don't think ordinary Americans, given the scale of problems that they are facing, would really be looking at the nitty-gritty of the Secretary of State. I think they know very well that Mike Pompeo is very closely aligned with Mr. Trump. So I don't think that would matter. But I think what matters is that how it accentuates an already very polarized, vitiated environment where Mr. Trump is seen as using all the props of his office to make a case to his base and not even to the entire country that he should be the president and he should be reelected as the president. And I think Mr. Pompeo's behavior falls in that pattern. But I don't think that is a game changer in any way. But clearly what seems to be at the moment the larger reality that increasingly this polarization would define the election, increasingly whether you are with Mr. Trump or against Mr. Trump, and how Mr. Trump plays on this dynamic will be the final arbiter of who crosses that line and who wins the presidency. But there are huge, significantly bigger issues at stake here, and especially on foreign policy. If you see what we have witnessed is apart from the tall claims that some of the Mr. Trump supporters made in the speech, really what we are witnessing now is the China centrality and how this division between China and between Biden and Trump plays out. Because the whole focus of Trump campaign going forward is going to be that Biden is a candidate of China. The Chinese would like Biden to win. And I think that's going to be the narrative that you will see more and more played out, because that's a narrative that suits Mr. Trump. And that's a narrative that he hopes would take the focus away from domestic problems.
Yes, and he's reiterating it. And he's reiterating that China will take control of America if Biden wins. Also how he's shattering the American dream. Harsh, I would also like to understand, and I would like you to analyze the Indo-Japan ties vis-a-vis Shinzo Abe's resignation. A chronic ailment has resurfaced. Prime Minister Modi tweeted about it and expressed his sorrow and pain. We know that during his tenure, during his second term, Abe helped build the India-Japan ties or took the relationship further. In fact, he was the one who revived the Quad, and we saw a solid alliance with Japan. India and Japan came close in the Indo-Pacific, architecture. And we also saw that Shinzo Abe was a very valuable G7 leader for India in terms of he was focused on economic and strategic deliverables. Now, looking at all that, whoever is Abe's successor will probably have big shoes to fill. And where do you see and how do you see the India-Japan ties shaping up going further?
I think, India-Japan ties have matured, have grown, have expanded, have diversified significantly in the last two decades. And whoever becomes the next prime minister in Japan would take that relationship forward, would be working with India in terms of strengthening that. But there is no doubt that Mr. Abe played the central role in shaping this relationship as it has evolved over the last almost, I think, 15 to 16 years now. And this is not simply his second term in prime ministership. If you recall the first term, when he was prime minister for a very short period, the major contribution was to define Indo-Pacific. Before that, no one talked about Indo-Pacific. So,
Definitely.
his contribution is not simply in terms of bringing India and Japan together, but also in terms of how he has articulated a larger regional response, not only to China's rise, but to evolving realities. And the fact that he was the first one when he visited India and addressed Indian Parliament. In his first term, he articulated the need to look at Indian and Pacific Oceans as one entity, the confluence of the two seas, as he called it. And that became the single most important idea in shaping the narrative of Indo-Pacific. After that, everyone got on board, and everyone tried to take the claim that this is something that needs to be done. But it was his vision about the region that has shaped not only Japanese foreign policy, but Indian foreign policy in a significant way. So I think his contribution to the relationship, his contribution to the strategic posture in the region, his contribution to larger response in the region that is evolving in terms of changing ground realities cannot be underestimated and should not be underestimated. And I think, therefore, when it comes to India will feel his absence very, very significantly, because, of course, in bilateral relations, not only has he bridged the gap that used to exist in the past between the two countries, but he's also, Mr. Modi has invested a lot in a personal relationship with Mr. Abe. And I think that, that will take some time with the new, whoever is the new leader. But but what has happened in the relationship is something which is fundamentally a part of how Mr. Abe has tried to reshape Japanese domestic policy in terms of how he wanted to make Japan a normal state, a state that was not under the constitutional constraints that were imposed after the Second World War. And so he wanted to, have a more relaxed military posture as far as Japan was concerned, make Japan more of a military power in the real sense of the term, and engage in a wider regional and global perspective as a major defense player. And that has been very, very important for India, because that helps India in the way the regional realities are evolving. India needs an anchor, a strong anchor in Japan that can actually contribute to regional stability at a time when China is just shattering the regional norms, institutions, and the structural realities. So Japan, therefore, has been a very, very important player under Abe, not simply because what he did to India, bilateral relations with India, but also how he revived a new aspiration within Japan to play a larger regional role, and also how he reshaped the regional narrative in terms of the Indo-Pacific. So I think there are multiple factors here at play, which I think his successor will have to take due cognizance of and take it forward. Otherwise, we will, there's a danger that we might go back to those olden days where Japan was a very important economic player, but never taken seriously as a strategic partner or a strategic player.
Yes, yes. Like you said, especially with regard to the Chinese footprints in our neighborhood becoming bolder. Let us look at Bangladesh. Japan was very important and is very important an ally for us. Now, China is trying to increase its footprint in all of India's neighbors, its presence and improving ties. And we cannot blame China for that, but we need to really step up our efforts. And we saw Foreign Secretary Shringla visit Dhaka to, there were speculations that there are strained ties and this is a visit to improve the tie. But the truth is that there is an increasing Chinese presence there, and China's, even in Bangladesh. But when he went there, the welcome that he received, the reception that he got, even though people in Bangladesh know him, he's been there. This was his second visit during the pandemic, but it was posted there, all of that. But we did not see that warmth really during his visit that he would have expected. So was it just to convey a message? How do you analyze this? The apparent reason was that he went to convey a message by the Prime Minister to Bangladesh. But we know that there is increasing Chinese presence, and that threat is also looming large, and India-Bangladesh relationships need to be worked upon.
See, I think, Nagma, there are two things here. One is China remains an important factor in all our neighbors, and we have to be cognizant of that reality. But it is also true that, India can't really do much about it, because, China and our smaller neighbors will have their own engagement, which will be, irrespective of India's engagement with with our neighbors. So I think at some point, at some level, we have to keep an eye on what China is doing, but China cannot be the determining factor in our approach towards our neighbors. With Bangladesh in particular, I think there is a sense that this is a phase, both because of Sheikh Hasina's leadership and because of the kind of investments that India has made in Bangladesh over the last few years, that this is one of the better periods that we have seen in the relationship. That are actually, there has been actually growth in every way. Whether you look at the connectivity projects, whether you look at the number of visas, which is the largest number of visas we give to Bangladeshis, whether it is in terms of how engaged we are at a high level, top level. After all, the foreign secretary's visit was his first visit post-COVID lockdown to any foreign country. So in that sense, India was signaling to Bangladesh how important Bangladesh is in India's foreign policy matrix. And the fact that he met the Prime Minister and all the top leadership, I think that conveys a sense that both sides are invested in the relationship. The China factor will always have a role, and it will always be at the in a way, China factor should not overshadow our engagement with our neighbors. But that tends to happen because at times, when it comes to China, the numbers are so big. So we often end up comparing, look, China is giving so many billions and we are giving so many millions, and therefore the Chinese deep pockets often come to play. But it is also, I think, important to recognize what is actually happening on the ground. So I'm not so sure that all that advertisement that Chinese investments often, result in, there is the reality on the ground is equally, dramatic. The reality on the ground at times is not in sync with these larger declarations, with these larger rhetorical numbers. Even with Pakistan, for example, if you look at the number of often which we are told of 62 billion investment in China-Pakistan economic corridor, the biggest investment as part of BRI. But what is happening on the ground? We don't see the result. So in a sense, the numbers don't convey the real sense of what is happening. India, with relatively more modest investments and engagement, I think has been able to do much more. The question is whether we are able to articulate it, whether we are able to engage with our partners in a way that conveys to them that we are, that we remain engaged and that we want to continue to have a relationship that is productive for both sides. I think that's where we are moving. But given that smaller neighbors will always have agency, they always have two big powers to play around with, that they play one off against the other, and that is something that should be expected. They would try to take the best possible deal for themselves, and in the process, India will have to ramp up its efforts in terms of continuous engagement. And I think what Foreign Secretary's visit did was to actually make that argument that India is engaged with, even at a time like this, when there are multiple other problems facing both India and Bangladesh. But I think, given that we're talking about Japan, I also wanted to bring in Japan, how important Japan has become in our neighborhood engagement. Because, when we often talk of China on one side, but India has been trying with Japan to make these trilateral engagements. India, Japan have been working together in countries like Bangladesh, in Nepal, and even trying in Sri Lanka to engage with these countries so that to bring greater capacities that both India and Japan have in the service of the requirements of these smaller countries. And I think that is something that has been an innovation in the way India has operated in recent years compared to in the past, when India was not willing to work with third countries as far as the neighborhood was concerned.
So like you just mentioned, India's engagement with its neighbors, and you also mentioned Sri Lanka with the change of government there. What are the signals coming out of Sri Lanka?
Some very interesting ones, I think, because with Rajapaksa there is a history with the Mahinda Rajapaksa. The relations last time he was in power, the relations were not very strong, and he seemed to be tilting too much towards China. What has happened is something very interesting. We have heard last week important statement from Sri Lankan Foreign Secretary saying that as far as strategic issues are concerned, Sri Lanka would follow an India first policy. And he was quite candid in acknowledging that when the Rajapakshas were in power last time, perhaps Sri Lanka tilted too much towards China and therefore made India a bit insecure. And I think this is a remarkable acknowledgement of the problems that often bedevil India's relations with its smaller neighbors in South Asia. And I think if there is recognition on both sides that there are certain red lines that both sides will have to operate within, that they can't cross those red lines, whether it is India taking the sensitivities of its neighbors into account, or whether it's India's neighbors taking Indian sensitivities into account. I think this is an important signal. And I think signal coming out from Gotabaya Rajapaksa's government, where there have been some concerns in India about whether they would go back to their old, Mahinda's days of being closer to China. My sense is that they have recognized the challenge, they know the challenge, and they are willing to work with India to dispel that notion that they would move in one way or another. I think the acknowledgement that it would be a India first policy in security issues is a brave acknowledgement. And I think the fact that since Gotabaya has been in power over the last few months, we have seen a very pragmatic engagement with India that is likely to continue, signals that the relationship is probably going to be between India and Sri Lanka going to be much more pragmatic, much more outcome oriented, and much more devoid of unnecessary historical rhetoric than in the past.
And lastly, let's look at the India-China relationship. We know all the bans, and we know the strained ties, and many apps being banned, all of that. We've recently, the government decision of banning the import of toys, the Chinese toys, which constituted a huge percent of the import that was coming in, basically the cheap toys. So the India-China engagement is being deliberately reduced to the signals that India is giving out. How would China reciprocate? First of all, the retaliation that we're expecting, but we're also seeing that this is being played out on all platforms, wherever there is the presence of India and China. Like India has withdrawn from the multilateral war games in Russia. There was no apparent reason given, but probably because of the Chinese presence there, because China and Pakistan are going to participate. So this is being played out on all platforms, global platforms.
Yes, and I think my sense is that this is likely to continue, because I don't think, given what is happening on the border, given that negotiations are actually not proceeding the way India would have liked them to, and the fact that the Chinese continue to build their infrastructure, their military capacity along the border, including at the India-Nepal China tri-junction on the Mansarovar road. I think all of that is pretty significant. Mm-hmm. So India will use whatever leverage it has to demonstrate to the Chinese its intent of not really accepting Chinese behavior, and therefore I think the signal of not participating in the SCO exercise is very, very important, because many would have argued that this is a multilateral exercise. This has nothing to do with India-China bilateral, and Russians actually had invited India. Mm-hmm. So and perhaps India would participate. But I think the fact that now we are witnessing India even not joining multilateral institutions, multilateral frameworks, and making a case that this is not done. This is something that India cannot have a normal relationship with China, is a very important signal that the relations are actually in deep freeze, that relations will not be able to recover unless there is a significant movement from the Chinese side. So India has put the onus on China to demonstrate its commitment to the relationship. We have had some statements from the Chinese ambassador in India, who has made some statements here and there, but they are not convincing enough. They don't demonstrate the commitment to a relationship perhaps that goes beyond just the immediate border problem. And I think given what the Chinese are doing along the border, it sounds that we are in, for status quo as far as the relationship is concerned for a long time. The winters are setting in, and it would be interesting to see whether the military build-up continues, or whether the weather finally becomes a determinant in ensuring that some kind of a thaw emerges in the relationship. My sense is that it is very unlikely, but we'll wait and watch.
All right. Even though we've had statements coming out of China basically pretending that everything is normal and whatever happened in the Galwan Valley was not really a big thing if we look at the history and if we look at the future of the relationship of two big giant economies. Thank you so much for that analysis, Harsh. This is so that's it from us this week on the Ideas Factory. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.